When the Duke of Westmoreland humiliated Lady Eleanor before all of society, he never imagined she would find strength in the silent maid he once dismissed. But as Eleanor discovers her true worth beyond the ballroom, we're left to wonder, must we lose everything we thought we wanted before we can find what we truly need? The morning light came in through the windows of Thornfield Hall, making pretty patterns on Lady Eleanor's face as she stood in front of her mirror. Her maid was putting the last pearl pin in her fancy hair. "The Duke of Westmoreland is here, my lady," said the footman with a bow. Eleanor's heart beat faster. After 5 years of careful planning, tonight's dance would end with her getting engaged to the best man in England. Her future, safe, proper, and all planned out, looked as neat as the garden she could see from her window. "Tell him I'll be down soon," she said, making sure her voice sounded gentle and nice. Downstairs, the Duke was waiting, with lots of mothers and young ladies around him. He looked at each one with cold eyes until Eleanor came down the big stairs in her white silk dress and family jewels. Everyone got quiet when she walked up. "Lady Eleanor," the Duke said with a small nod, "are you ready for tonight's big news?" "Yes, Your Grace," she said, looking down shyly like she'd been taught since she was little. "I've been getting ready for this my whole life." Eleanor knew what was expected. Since she was a child, her mother had taught her how to walk, talk, and act like a proper lady. She could play the piano, sing sweetly, and make small talk about the weather without ever saying anything that might upset someone. She was perfect, or so everyone said. As she stood next to the Duke, she could feel how cold his hand was on hers. He was 15 years older, with a sharp nose and eyes that seemed to find fault with everything they saw. But he was rich and important, and marrying him was what her family wanted. "You look lovely tonight," said Lady Pembroke, an old friend of Eleanor's mother. "The Duke is quite lucky." "Thank you," Eleanor said with the right amount of modesty. "I hope to be worthy of him." But inside, a tiny voice wondered if there should be more to life than being worthy of someone else. The Duke led her to the middle of the room where everyone could see them. "Lady Eleanor is everything a woman should be," he told his friends. "Quiet, beautiful, and from a good family." Eleanor smiled, though the words felt strange. Was that really all a woman should be? The big clock in the hall struck 7, and servants began to bring in food on silver trays. There were tiny sandwiches no bigger than a thumb, cakes covered in pink sugar, and drinks in crystal glasses. Eleanor ate almost nothing. Ladies never showed hunger. "You'll make a fine duchess," said Lord Hartley, an old man with a red face. "Just what Westmoreland needs. Someone who knows her place and keeps to it." Eleanor nodded, though she wasn't sure if that was a nice thing to say or not. The room felt hot, and the tight dress made it hard to breathe. Through the window she could see the gardener still working, even though it was getting dark. One small woman with dirt on her hands was cutting roses for the tables. She worked quickly and well, but no one noticed her. Eleanor watched her for a moment, feeling oddly drawn to someone so different from herself. "Eleanor, pay attention," her mother whispered sharply. "The Duke is speaking to you." "Forgive me," Eleanor said, turning back. "I was just admiring the roses." The Duke frowned. "I didn't ask for your thoughts on flowers. I was discussing our wedding plans." "Of course," she said quickly. "Whatever you think best." Later, as music played and people danced, Eleanor stood by the Duke's side, smiling at everyone who came to talk to them. Her cheeks hurt from smiling so much. "You're very quiet tonight," the Duke said. "I hope you're not having second thoughts." "Not at all," Eleanor lied. "I'm just taking it all in." But as she looked around the room at the women in their fancy dresses and men in their black suits, she had a strange feeling that she was watching a play where everyone knew their lines except her. In the garden, the small woman was still working, now cleaning up after the party had moved inside. No one thanked her. No one even saw her. Yet she seemed more real than anyone in the ballroom. "It's time," the Duke said, tapping a spoon against his glass. Everyone got quiet. "I have an announcement to make." Eleanor took a deep breath. This was it. The moment her whole life had led to. She would be engaged to the Duke, and in 3 months she would be a duchess. Everyone would say how lucky she was. "Ladies and gentlemen," the Duke began, his voice loud in the quiet room. "As you know, I have been looking for the perfect woman to be my duchess." Eleanor felt all eyes on her. She tried to look happy and humble at the same time. "A duchess must be beyond fault," the Duke continued. "She must be beautiful, but not vain, Smart but not too smart, proper in every way. The room was so quiet now that Eleanor could hear the clock ticking. Tick-tock, tick-tock, counting down to her new life. Lady Eleanor has been raised for this role, the Duke said, looking at her with those cold eyes. She is exactly what society expects a duchess to be. Eleanor waited for him to ask her to marry him, to slip a ring on her finger, to make it official. But something in his face made her heart sink. Something wasn't right. Outside, the small garden woman had finished her work. Eleanor watched through the window as she walked away. Her back straight, her steps sure. She didn't need anyone to tell her she was doing things right. She just knew. The Duke took Eleanor's hand, but his touch felt like ice. "Are you ready, my dear, to become everything I need you to be?" Eleanor smiled and nodded, but deep inside, in a place she rarely listened to, a tiny voice was asking, "Who am I beyond what others need me to be?" The ballroom of Thornfield Hall sparkled with 1,000 candles. Their light bounced off the crystal cups and silver plates, making the room glow like magic. The music stopped when the Duke held up his hand for everyone to be quiet. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said in a voice that reached every corner of the big room, "I asked you here tonight to see something very important." Eleanor stood next to him, looking perfect like a lady should. Her smile was bright, but her hands shook a little, so she hid them in the folds of her dress. She had waited for this moment since she was a little girl. "Everyone knows I need to pick a wife who comes from a good family and has good manners," the Duke went on. "Tonight I'm going to do what everyone expects." A happy buzz went around the room. Eleanor's mother dabbed at her eyes with a small cloth. Her father stood up straighter, proud that his daughter would soon be a duchess. "But," the Duke's voice suddenly got cold like water turning to ice, "I find I can't pick Lady Eleanor like I planned." The room got so quiet you could hear the candles burning. Eleanor felt all the blood rush from her face, leaving her cold from head to toe. "While Lady Eleanor is pretty enough and comes from a good family," the Duke said, his words falling like sharp little stones, "I find she has no real thoughts in her head or fire in her heart. I can't marry someone so empty inside." People gasped. Ladies covered their mouths with their hands. Men looked at the floor, not knowing what to say. Eleanor stood frozen, watching her careful life break into pieces all around her. "She is like a pretty doll," the Duke went on, as if he was talking about a thing and not a person standing right next to him. "Beautiful to look at, but nothing inside. A duchess must be more than that." Eleanor felt a strange thing happen inside her. The shame and hurt were there. Yes, big and awful, but underneath them was something else. Something that felt like anger. "Your Grace," she finally said, her voice small at first but getting stronger. "I think I must say no to you. Not the other way around. I could never tie myself to a man who would hurt a woman just to make himself look big and important." Now the gasps were even louder. No one talked back to the Duke, especially not a woman. Before he could answer, Eleanor turned and walked slowly through the crowd. People stepped back to let her pass, some with pity in their eyes, some with mean little smiles. She kept her head up, her back straight, her steps even. She would not run. She would not cry. Not where they could see. Only when she reached her room did the first tear fall. She rang for her maid, a kind girl named Mary, who'd been with her since they were both children. "Pack my things," Eleanor said, her voice shaking now. "Not the ball gowns or the jewels, just simple dresses and books. I'm leaving tonight." "But where will you go, my lady?" Mary asked, her eyes wide with worry. "To Wildwood Cottage, to my Aunt Sophia." Mary nodded and began to pack. Everyone knew about Aunt Sophia, though no one talked about her in polite company. She had turned down 3 good marriages to live alone and write books. People called her odd, but Eleanor had always thought she seemed happy when they visited. While Mary packed, Eleanor sat at her writing desk. She could hear the ball going on below. The music had started again, the talk and laughter. They had already moved on from her shame. She took out paper and a pen. First, she wrote to her parents. "Dear Mother and Father, I'm going to stay with Aunt Sophia for a while. I need time to think. Please do not try to bring me home. Your loving daughter, Eleanor." Then she wrote a second note, this one to the Duke. "Your Grace, you are right that I am not what you need in a duchess, but you are wrong to think I am empty. Perhaps I just never had the chance to be full. Eleanor, She sealed both letters and left them on her desk. Then she changed from her ball gown into a simple blue dress for travelling. The clock struck midnight as she fastened the last button. "The carriage is ready, my lady," Mary said, coming back into the room. "I've packed what you asked for." "Thank you, Mary," Eleanor said. "Will you come with me?" Mary looked sad. "I can't, my lady. My mother and sisters depend on what I earn here. But I'll pray for you every day." Eleanor nodded, understanding that not everyone could just leave when things got hard. She hugged Mary, something a lady should never do with a servant, but tonight she didn't care about rules. She slipped down the back stairs and out through the kitchen. The cook was asleep in a chair by the fire. The kitchen boys were playing cards at the table. No one saw her go. Outside, the night was cold and clear, with stars scattered across the black sky like diamonds on velvet. The carriage waited, a small one with just one horse, not the grand coach she usually rode in. "To Wildwood Cottage," she told the driver, an old man who had known her since she was a baby. "And please, not a word to anyone until morning." He nodded, his eyes kind. "Yes, my lady. Don't you worry now." As the carriage pulled away from the only home she had ever known, Eleanor finally let herself cry. The tears came hot and fast, washing away the face powder and rouge, leaving her just herself, plain and hurt, and not sure who she was anymore. Through her tears, she saw a small figure working in the garden even at this late hour. It was the same woman she'd noticed earlier. The woman looked up as the carriage passed and their eyes met for just a second. There was no pity in the woman's gaze, just a calm understanding that made Eleanor sit up a little straighter. The carriage rolled down the long drive, past the gates and onto the main road. Behind her, Thornfield Hall blazed with lights, the party still going strong without her. Ahead lay the dark road to Wildwood Cottage, to Aunt Sophia, to a future she couldn't see clearly. The Duke's cruel words echoed in her head. Empty, he had called her. Was he right? Had she spent so long trying to be what others wanted that there was nothing truly her own inside? As the miles passed and the night grew deeper, Eleanor's tears slowed and then stopped. In their place came something new, a question that she had never let herself ask before. If she wasn't the perfect lady, the future Duchess, the good daughter, then who was she? The carriage rocked gently from side to side as the horse trotted on. By the time the first pink light of dawn touched the sky, Eleanor had made up her mind about one thing at least. She would find out who she really was, even if it hurt, even if it meant never going back to the life she had always known. Wildwood Cottage wasn't really a cottage at all. It was a big stone house with many rooms, sitting on a cliff above the sea. The walls were rough grey stone covered with climbing plants, and the windows were tall and let in lots of light. It looked wild and free, just like Aunt Sophia herself. When Eleanor's carriage pulled up, the sun was just coming up. The sky was pink and gold, and birds were singing in the tall trees around the house. Eleanor stepped down, her legs stiff from the long ride. She had cried so much that her eyes hurt and her head ached. The front door opened, and there stood Aunt Sophia. She wasn't dressed like other ladies Eleanor knew. She wore a simple brown dress with no frills or lace, and her grey hair was pulled back in a knot instead of being curled and pinned. She didn't look like a rich lady, but she looked strong and sure of herself. "You've come at last," Aunt Sophia said, not looking surprised at all to see Eleanor at her door so early in the morning, still in her blue travelling dress with her face red from crying. "I've been waiting for you for years." "You knew I would come?" Eleanor asked, stepping into the cool stone hallway. "You knew about what happened with the Duke?" "I didn't know what would bring you," Sophia said, leading Eleanor through the house to a sunny room with windows looking out at the sea. "But I knew something would. No bird can stay in a cage forever without trying to fly." Sophia helped Eleanor take off her travelling coat and sit in a big chair by the window. A servant brought hot tea and toast with honey. Eleanor wasn't hungry, but the tea warmed her cold hands. "Now," Sophia said, sitting across from her, "tell me everything." So Eleanor did. She told about the ball, about the Duke's cruel words, about how she'd walked away with her head high, but her heart broken. As she talked, the sea crashed on the rocks far below, wild and free and caring nothing for what people thought. "He called me empty," Eleanor finished, fresh tears coming to her eyes. And maybe he's right. I don't know who I am without all the rules telling me what to do and who to be. Then it's time you found out, Sophia said simply. You can stay here as long as you need. No one will bother you here. For the first few days, Eleanor barely left her room. It was a pretty room at the top of the house with a window seat where she could look out at the sea. Sometimes it was blue and calm with little white waves like lace on a dress. Other times it was grey and angry with big waves that crashed on the rocks and sent spray high into the air. Eleanor watched the sea change and felt a little better, knowing that even the ocean had many moods. She didn't write letters, she didn't read books, she just sat and watched the sea and thought about her life. For 20 years, she had done everything right, everything expected of her, and in the end, it hadn't been enough. The Duke had seen through her perfect manners and pretty face to the emptiness inside. After a week, Sophia knocked on her door. Enough hiding, she said. Come down to dinner tonight. It's just us and my friend Dr. Harrison. He won't care what happened in London. So Eleanor put on one of the simple dresses Mary had packed and went downstairs. Dr. Harrison was an older man with kind eyes behind round glasses. He didn't ask why she was there or talk about London or the Duke. Instead, he talked about the birds he was studying and the book he was writing. Do you like birds, Lady Eleanor? He asked. I don't know, Eleanor said, surprised at the question. No one had ever asked what she liked before. I've never really thought about it. That's the problem with being a lady, Sophia said, passing Eleanor more potatoes. No one ever asks what you think or like. They just tell you what you should think and like. After dinner, Eleanor went back to her room, but the next day she came down for breakfast. And the day after that, she walked in the garden with Sophia. Slowly, she began to join the world again. One morning, about 3 weeks after she arrived, Eleanor went for a walk along the cliff. The path was narrow and a bit scary, with a long drop to the rocks and sea below. But she felt safer with each step. At a turn in the path, she saw a small figure working in a vegetable garden on a flat piece of land. It was a woman, small and strong, with brown hands that moved quickly among the plants. As Eleanor got closer, she saw that it was the same woman who had been working in the garden at Thornfield Hall the night of the ball, the woman who had met her eyes as she fled in the carriage. "Hello," Eleanor said, stopping by the garden gate. The woman looked up. She had a nice face, not pretty in the way ladies tried to be, but strong and real. She nodded at Eleanor but didn't speak. "Do you work here now?" Eleanor asked. The woman nodded again and pointed to the vegetables. "Are you the gardener?" Another nod. Eleanor wasn't sure what to make of this strange silent conversation. Then she heard Sophia's voice behind her. "I see you've met Margaret," Sophia said, coming up the path with a basket on her arm. "She's been with me for about 6 months now." "She doesn't talk much," Eleanor said. "She doesn't talk at all," Sophia corrected. "She was born without the ability to speak, but her hands speak for her, don't they, Margaret?" Margaret smiled and held up a perfect red tomato she had just picked. "Margaret used to work at Westmoreland Castle," Sophia went on, taking the tomato and putting it in her basket. "The Duke's home, but he let her go when he took over from his father, said he didn't want servants who couldn't answer when spoken to." Eleanor felt her face get hot with anger. That's terrible. Just because she can't speak doesn't mean she can't hear or think or feel. The Duke doesn't care much about what servants think or feel, Sophia said, or what women think or feel for that matter. Margaret went back to her work, but Eleanor noticed how carefully she handled each plant, how she seemed to know just what each one needed. Her hands moved with a grace that reminded Eleanor of a dance, but a real one, not the stiff, proper dances she'd learned for balls. That night, Eleanor couldn't sleep. She kept thinking about Margaret, working silently in the garden, let go by the Duke because she couldn't speak. Yet there was nothing empty about Margaret. She might not have words, but she had so much else. Skill, grace, knowledge. The next morning, Eleanor went to find Margaret again. The sun was just coming up, painting the sea gold. Margaret was already in the garden, watering the plants. "Could you teach me?" Eleanor asked. "About the garden, I mean." Margaret looked surprised, then smiled and nodded. She handed Eleanor a spare watering can and showed her how to water the plants gently, right at the roots, not on the leaves where the sun might burn them. For the first time since the ball, Eleanor felt like she was doing something real, something that mattered. Her hands got dirty and her back started to ache, but she didn't care. This was nothing like the piano playing or embroidery she had learned as a lady. This was useful. Every day after that, Eleanor spent time in the garden with Margaret. She learned which plants liked sun and which liked shade, which needed lots of water and which just a little. Margaret couldn't tell her with words, but she showed her with hands and gestures and smiles. Slowly something began to grow in Eleanor. Not just knowledge about plants, but something else. Something that had been missing before. A feeling of being real, of being herself, not just what others wanted her to be. One evening, a month after she'd come to Wildwood Cottage, Eleanor sat with Sophia on the porch watching the sun set over the sea. "I think I'm starting to understand," Eleanor said. "What's that?" Sophia asked. "What the Duke meant when he called me empty. I was trying so hard to be perfect that I never figured out who I really am. But Margaret can't speak, and the Duke thought that made her worth less. Yet she knows exactly who she is and what she can do." Sophia smiled and took Eleanor's hand, now rough from garden work. "So," she said, "who is Eleanor Harrington when she's not trying to be a perfect lady?" Eleanor looked out at the wild sea, at the garden where Margaret had taught her so much, at her own dirty hands. "I don't know yet," she said, "but I think I'm ready to find out." One morning, when the summer sun was already hot in the sky, Aunt Sophia walked into the garden where Eleanor was helping Margaret pick beans. Eleanor's face was brown from the sun now, and her hands were no longer soft and white like a lady's hands should be. They were strong and had little cuts and dirt under the nails. "You've been here 2 months," Sophia said, looking at Eleanor with a small smile. "Your skin is brown and your mind is empty." Eleanor looked up, hurt. "Empty? Like the Duke said?" "No, not like that," Sophia said quickly. "Empty like a cup waiting to be filled. Empty like a field ready for seeds. It's a good kind of empty." Sophia dropped a pile of books onto the bench where Eleanor had left her sun hat. The books made a heavy thump that scared a bird out of the nearby bush. "You've been trained to look pretty," Sophia said, pointing at the books. "Now it's time you learn to think." Eleanor wiped her hands on her apron and picked up the top book. It had a plain brown cover with gold letters that said Natural Philosophy. "What is this?" she asked. "It's about how the world works," Sophia explained. "The stars and plants and animals and why things fall down instead of up." The next book was about numbers and shapes. The one after that was full of poems. There were 10 books in all, on all kinds of things that Eleanor had never studied before. "Ladies don't need to know these things," Eleanor said, repeating what her mother had always told her. "That," said Sophia firmly, "is exactly why ladies should know these things." At first, Eleanor just put the books on the shelf in her room. She was busy in the garden with Margaret, and reading hard books seemed like too much work. But one day it rained so hard that they couldn't go outside. Eleanor was bored, so she picked up the book of poems. The first poem was about a bird in a cage that sang even though it wasn't free. Eleanor read it 3 times, feeling like the poet had somehow seen into her heart. She had been that bird, singing the songs others taught her, never knowing she could make her own music. After the poem book, Eleanor tried the one about stars. It was harder, with big words and strange ideas, but Sophia helped her when she got stuck. They would sit by the fire in the evenings, with the rain pattering on the windows, and talk about how the stars moved in the sky, and how the earth circled the sun. "Did you know," Eleanor said one night at dinner, her eyes bright with excitement, "that it takes light from the sun 8 minutes to reach us?" 8 whole minutes! If the sun went out right now, we wouldn't know for 8 minutes. Dr. Harrison, who came for dinner once a week, smiled. "That's right, and light from the next nearest star takes years to reach us." "Years?" Eleanor said, amazed. "So we're always seeing the past when we look at the stars?" "Yes," said Sophia. "Just like society always sees the past when they look at women. They can't imagine us being more than we were before." Eleanor thought about this as she lay in bed that night, listening to the waves crash on the rocks below. She had always looked at herself through others' eyes. Her parents, her teachers, the Duke. What would she see if she looked with her own eyes? The next morning, Sophia found Eleanor already up and reading the book about plants and animals. "It says here that flowers have boy and girl parts," Eleanor said, not looking up. "The pollen is the boy part and the pistil is the girl part. Is that true?" "Yes," said Sophia, sitting down with her tea. "All living things need both male and female to make new life. But in humans, we've decided that men and women should be as different as possible. Men get education and jobs and power. Women get pretty dresses and babies." "That doesn't seem fair," Eleanor said, thinking of all the things she'd never been allowed to learn. "It's not," agreed Sophia. "That's why I never married. I couldn't give up my books and my freedom." Eleanor looked at her aunt with new eyes. She had always been told that Sophia was strange, maybe even a bit crazy. But now she saw a woman who had made her own choices, who had picked freedom over what society wanted. "The Duke called me empty," Eleanor said, the word still hurting even after months. "But he was the one who wanted me that way. He didn't want me to have my own thoughts." "Exactly," Sophia said. "Men like the Duke want a mirror, not a partner. They want to see themselves reflected back, not meet someone new and different." Every day, Eleanor read more. She learned about plants and stars and numbers and history. She learned about faraway countries where people lived differently than in England. She learned about women who had written books and made discoveries and ruled countries. But she didn't just learn from books. She learned from Margaret too. Margaret couldn't talk, but she knew so much. She could tell when it would rain by the way the air smelled. She knew which plants could heal cuts and which could make tea for a sore throat. She could speak with her hands and face better than most people could with words. One day, Eleanor found Margaret sitting on a rock by the sea, making something with her hands. "What are you doing?" Eleanor asked, sitting beside her. Margaret held up a small doll made of dried grass and flowers. It was beautiful, with a dress made of petals and hair of fine grass. "Did you learn to make these as a child?" Eleanor asked. Margaret nodded, then pointed at Eleanor with a questioning look. "What did I play with as a child?" Eleanor guessed. "I had china dolls with real hair and silk dresses, but I wasn't allowed to play with them much because they might break. They sat on a shelf and looked pretty like I was supposed to do." Margaret shook her head, her face sad. Then she handed the grass doll to Eleanor. "For me?" Eleanor asked. "Thank you." The doll was light in her hand, but strong. Eleanor could play with it, and if it broke, Margaret could make another one. It wasn't meant to sit on a shelf. It was meant to be used and enjoyed. Like people, Eleanor thought. One evening, as fall was turning the leaves red and gold, Dr. Harrison came for dinner with a tall, dark-haired man. "This is Professor Alessandro Visconti," Dr. Harrison said, "from Florence, in Italy. He's studying old rocks along the coast." The professor had kind eyes and a nice smile. He bowed to Eleanor. "Lady Eleanor, I've heard much about you from Dr. Harrison." Eleanor felt her face get hot. What had he heard? About how the Duke had shamed her, about how she'd run away. But the professor didn't seem to be thinking bad things about her. At dinner, he asked her what she was reading, and really listened to her answer. He didn't act surprised that she knew about stars or plants. In Italy, he told her, there was a woman named Maria who studied math and wrote a book about it. Her father was her teacher. Not all men think women should be kept in the dark. After dinner, they all sat in the library. Eleanor usually stayed quiet when Sophia had guests, but tonight she found herself talking about the book of poems she had read. "I loved the one about the bird in the cage," she said. "It made me think about how we all live in cages sometimes, ones we can't even see." "Freedom is first seen in the mind," the professor said. "Before we can break out of our cages, we must see that they are there." Later, as she got ready for bed, Eleanor thought about what the professor had said. For years, she had lived in a cage made of rules about how ladies should act. The Duke had seen her cage and judged her for it, not understanding that he was one of the people who had put her there. She picked up the grass doll Margaret had made her and smiled. Margaret couldn't speak with her voice, but she had found other ways to be heard. The Duke had called her broken, but she wasn't. She was just different. "Maybe I'm not empty after all," Eleanor whispered to herself as she fell asleep. "Maybe I'm just starting to be full." Fall turned the world around Wildwood Cottage into a painting of red, orange and gold. The garden was mostly done for the year, with just a few tough vegetables still growing. Eleanor spent more time inside now, reading by the fire or helping Sophia with her writing. One morning, when the wind was blowing the last leaves from the trees, a letter arrived. The paper was thick and cream-coloured, with a fancy seal on the back. Eleanor turned it over in her hands, her heart beating fast. Had her parents found her? Was it from the Duke? But the seal wasn't one she knew. She broke it open and read the flowing writing inside. "It's from Lady Montclair," she told Sophia, who was knitting by the fire. "She lives at Montclair Hall, just 3 miles from here. She's having a dinner party next week and wants us to come." Sophia looked up from her knitting. Interesting. Lady Montclair doesn't usually bother with me. I'm too odd for her usual parties. She says she's heard I'm staying with you and would like to meet me, Eleanor said, still reading. She says Professor Visconti will be there, talking about his work with old rocks. Ah, Sophia said with a small smile. Now I see. Rebecca Montclair always did like having interesting people at her parties, not just the usual rich folk, and she probably heard about what happened in London and is curious to see the lady who walked away from a duke. Eleanor put the letter down. I'm not going. I can't face people yet. What if they laugh at me or whisper behind my hands? People will always talk, Sophia said. The question is, do you care what they say? For 3 days, Eleanor thought about the invitation. She walked by the sea, talked with Margaret in their special sign language they had made up, and read her books. But she kept thinking about the party. I think I'll go, she finally told Sophia, not to show off or to find another rich man, but because I want to hear what the professor has to say about rocks. Sophia smiled. Good. And what will you wear? Eleanor looked down at her plain dress, worn from gardening and walks by the sea. I don't have anything fancy anymore. I left all that behind. Good, Sophia said again. You'll go as yourself, not as the perfect lady everyone expected you to be. The night of the party was cold but clear, with stars shining like diamonds in the black sky. Eleanor wore her best dress, a simple blue one that matched her eyes. Her hair, once always put up in fancy curls, now hung down her back in a simple braid. You look lovely, Sophia told her as they got into the carriage. Natural, like a real person instead of a doll. Eleanor's hands shook a little as the carriage rolled up the long drive to Montclair Hall. The big house glowed with lights, and she could see people moving inside. For a moment she remembered the last party she'd gone to, when the Duke had broken her heart in front of everyone. I can't do this, she whispered. Sophia took her hand. Yes, you can. You're not the same person who ran away from Thornfield Hall. You've grown. Inside, the big hall was warm and bright. A fire burned in the huge fireplace, and candles glowed on every table. About 30 people stood in small groups, talking and laughing. It wasn't as big or fancy as the balls Eleanor had gone to in London, but it still made her heart beat fast. Lady Montclair came to meet them, a tall woman with kind eyes and grey hair. Sophia, how good of you to come, and this must be Lady Eleanor. Welcome to Montclair Hall. Eleanor waited for the questions about London, about the Duke, but Lady Montclair just smiled and led them to the fire. Professor Visconti has been telling us about the amazing rocks he found along the coast, she said. Rocks that tell us about animals that lived long before people were here. The professor stood by the fire, his dark eyes lighting up when he saw Eleanor. Lady Eleanor, Miss Harrington, how nice to see you again. Tell Lady Eleanor about the rocks you found with the fish inside, Lady Montclair said. They're called fossils, the professor explained. Animals or plants that died long ago and turned to stone. I found some with fish that no longer swim in our seas. It tells us that the world was very different long ago. Eleanor found herself asking questions, forgetting to be shy or worried about what people thought. How long ago did these fish live? How did they turn to stone? Are there fossils of other animals too? The professor answered each question, never acting like she was silly for asking, or that she wouldn't understand the answers. Other people joined their group, adding to the talk. One man had found a fossil of a big sea animal that looked like a snake. A woman had a collection of stone plants. As they talked, a servant brought around drinks and little foods on silver trays. Eleanor took a small cake, and as she turned, she almost ran into a woman carrying a tray of empty glasses. I'm so sorry, Eleanor said, then stopped surprised. Margaret, do you work here too? Margaret smiled and nodded. She looked different in her black dress with a white apron, her hair neat under a cap, but her eyes were the same, kind and smart. You know my maid? Asked Lady Montclair. Yes. She also works in my aunt's garden, Eleanor explained. She's taught me so much about plants. Lady Montclair looked surprised. Most ladies wouldn't bother to know a servant's name, let alone learn from one. Margaret's a good teacher, Eleanor said, even without words. Margaret's eyes thanked her, then she went back to her work. Eleanor watched her go, noticing how some people moved out of her way, while others didn't even seem to see her. It was like Margaret was invisible to them. Someone touched Eleanor's arm. It was the professor. Would you like to see some of my fossils? He asked. I brought a few to show tonight. Eleanor followed him to a table where several stone slabs lay on a velvet cloth. Each one had the shape of a creature pressed into it, fish with delicate fins, shell animals with swirls like tiny mazes, plants with leaves spread out like fans. They're beautiful, Eleanor said, touching one gently, like art made by time. Exactly, the professor said, his face lighting up. Most people just see rocks. You see the beauty and the story they tell. As they talked about the fossils, Eleanor felt someone watching her. She looked up to see a man staring at her from across the room. He was tall with grey at his temples, and something about him seemed familiar. Who is that man? She asked the professor. Lord Blackwood, he said. He's visiting Lady Montclair. I think he knows your former friend from London. Eleanor's heart sank. So that was it. Lord Blackwood knew the Duke and had probably heard all about her shame. Now he was staring at her, probably thinking about how far she had fallen. But when Lord Blackwood came over a few minutes later, he didn't mention the Duke at all. Lady Eleanor, he said with a bow, Professor Visconti tells me you have been learning about fossils. What do you think of his collection? Surprised, Eleanor found herself talking about the fossils, about how amazing it was to think of these creatures living so long ago. Lord Blackwood listened and asked good questions. Not once did he look at her like she was strange or fallen from grace. Later, as Eleanor and Sophia rode home in the carriage under the starry sky, Sophia asked, Well, how was it to go back into society? Eleanor thought about the evening, the interesting talks, the professor's kind attention, Lord Blackwood's respect, and Margaret's silent support from across the room. It was different, she said. I was different. Before, I was always trying to be perfect, to say the right things to impress people. Tonight, I just talked about what interested me, and people still listened, maybe even more than before. That's because you were real, Sophia said. People can feel the difference between someone who's just saying what they think they should and someone who's speaking from the heart. As the carriage rolled up to Wildwood Cottage, Eleanor looked up at the stars. 6 months ago, she hadn't known anything about them except that they were pretty. Now she knew they were suns far away, some of them dead long ago, their light only just reaching Earth. 6 months ago, she hadn't known who she really was either. But now, like the fossils in the professor's collection, she was beginning to see the shape of herself emerging from the stone of who she had been told to be. I think I'd like to go to more of Lady Montclair's parties, she said, and I'd like to learn more about fossils. Sophia smiled in the darkness. I think that can be arranged. Winter came to Wildwood Cottage, bringing short days and long nights. Snow covered the garden where Eleanor had worked with Margaret, and ice formed along the edges of the sea. But inside, by the big fireplace, Eleanor's world was growing bigger every day. Professor Visconti came often to Wildwood now. Sometimes he brought books or fossils to show Eleanor. Sometimes they just talked by the fire while Sophia worked on her writing. Once a week they all went to Lady Montclair's house for dinner and talks about books and science and faraway places. Would you like to see where I found the best fossils? The professor asked one clear, cold day when the sun made the snow sparkle like tiny stars had fallen on the ground. It's not far, just down the cliff path to a small beach. The tide will be out for a few hours. Eleanor looked at Sophia, who nodded with a small smile. Take Margaret with you. She knows the safe paths down the cliff. So Eleanor put on her warmest coat and boots, and she and Margaret and the professor walked carefully down the narrow path that wound down the face of the cliff. The sea below was grey-blue and calm today, with small waves lapping at the shore. Look there, the professor said when they reached the pebbly beach. He pointed to the cliff wall where layers of rock were stacked like the pages of a giant book. Each layer tells a story about a different time long ago. Eleanor touched the cold stone, feeling the rough and smooth parts. How do you read the stories? The professor showed her how some layers had marks of tiny sea animals, while others had plants or different kinds of dirt. This layer here, he said, pointing to a dark stripe, was once the bottom of a lake, full of fish and plants, and this one above it was a forest. It's like looking back in time, Eleanor said, amazed. Yes, the professor smiled. That's exactly what it is. They spent hours on the beach, looking at rocks and finding small fossils that the professor let Eleanor keep. Margaret showed them a hidden cave where the walls sparkled with tiny crystals when they held up the lantern they had brought. It's like a palace for mermaids, Eleanor said, her voice echoing in the cave. The professor laughed. "You have a poet's heart, Lady Eleanor." As they climbed back up the cliff path, the professor helping Eleanor over the icy patches, she realized she was happy. Not the careful, proper happiness she had once pretended to have, but a real warm feeling that made her cheeks glow and her eyes bright. The next day, the professor took her to the village library, a small stone building with books stacked on wooden shelves. It wasn't big or fancy like the libraries in London, but the old man who took care of it knew every book and loved to talk about them. "Miss Sophia says you like poems," the old librarian said to Eleanor. "Have you read these by Mr. Wordsworth? He writes about nature and how it makes the heart feel." Eleanor hadn't read them, so the librarian let her borrow the book. That night she read by the fire while the wind blew snow against the windows. The poems were about lakes and hills and stars, and they made her feel like the writer had seen the same beauty she was just discovering. A week later, there was a small party at Montclair Hall. Lady Montclair had invited a famous man who had sailed around the world to talk about the strange lands he had seen. Eleanor sat next to the professor, listening with wide eyes as the sailor described islands where flowers as big as dinner plates grew, and birds with rainbow feathers flew through the trees. "Have you ever wanted to see such places?" the professor asked her, as they had tea by the fire afterward. "I never thought about it before," Eleanor admitted. "Ladies aren't supposed to want adventures. We're supposed to want nice houses and pretty dresses." "And now?" he asked. "What do you want now?" Eleanor looked into her teacup thinking, "I want to learn things. I want to see beautiful places. I want to be real, not just a pretty doll that sits on a shelf." The professor nodded, his eyes warm. "In Italy, where I come from, there's a saying, 'The heart knows its own path before the head does.' I think your heart is finding its path, Lady Eleanor." On the way home that night, the carriage passed through the village. Light and music spilled from the windows of the inn, and people were dancing inside. "What's happening?" Eleanor asked, looking out at the happy scene. "It's the winter festival," Sophia explained. "The villagers celebrate to bring light to the darkest time of the year." "Can we stop?" Eleanor asked, surprising herself. Before, she would never have wanted to mix with common people at a village dance. Sophia raised her eyebrows but told the driver to stop. Inside the inn, it was warm and noisy. People were dancing to music played by men with fiddles and flutes. No one seemed to care that Eleanor and Sophia were ladies from a big house. They were just happy to have more people join the fun. "Would you like to dance?" asked a voice at Eleanor's elbow. It was the professor who had followed them from Montclair Hall. "I only know proper ballroom dances," Eleanor said, watching the villagers move in circles and lines, their steps quick and free. "These dances are easier," the professor said. "You just follow what everyone else does." So Eleanor joined a circle of dancers, holding hands with the professor on one side and a red-cheeked farm girl on the other. They moved in and out, around and around, and Eleanor found herself laughing as she hadn't laughed in years. Her hair came loose from its pins and her cheeks grew pink, but she didn't care. At the edge of the room, she saw Margaret watching, her eyes bright. Eleanor let go of the professor's hand and went to her friend. "Come dance," she said, taking Margaret's hand. "You don't need to talk to dance." At first, Margaret shook her head, but Eleanor gently pulled her into the circle. Soon Margaret was dancing too, her feet quick and sure, her face glowing with happiness. Later, as they walked home through the snow because it was too nice a night to ride in the carriage, the professor told Eleanor about winter festivals in Italy, where people wore masks and costumes and danced in the streets. "You should see Florence in the spring," he said. "The whole city smells like flowers, and the light on the river makes everything golden." "It sounds like a dream," Eleanor said. "It could be real," the professor said quietly. "You could see it someday." The words hung in the cold air between them, full of meaning that Eleanor wasn't quite ready to think about. But she felt something stir in her heart, like a bird preparing to fly. The next day, Eleanor went to the village again, this time to buy some wool for Sophia. As she came out of the shop, a fancy carriage rolled by, spraying slush from the street. Eleanor jumped back, but not before her dress was splattered. "Still not learned to watch where you're going, I see," said a cold voice from the carriage window. Eleanor froze. She knew that voice. It was the Duke of Westmoreland. He looked down at her from his high seat, his face as handsome and hard as she remembered. "Lady Eleanor, what a surprise to find you here, dressed like a farmer's daughter and walking in the mud." Eleanor felt her cheeks burn, but not with shame this time, with anger. "Your Grace," she said with a small bow that was just barely proper. "What brings you to our little village?" "Business at Blackwood Manor," the Duke said. "Lord Blackwood is helping me invest in some local land." "How nice," Eleanor said, her voice cool. "Our village is very pretty. I've grown quite fond of it." The Duke's eyes narrowed. "You've changed, Lady Eleanor. Country life has made you common." "Thank you," Eleanor said, surprising him. "I'd rather be common and real than proper and empty." Without waiting for him to answer, she turned and walked away. Her back straight and her head high. Her heart was pounding, but not with fear, with pride. 6 months ago she would have been crushed by the Duke's words. Now they just bounced off her like rain off a good cloak. That evening she told Sophia and the professor about seeing the Duke. "He looked exactly the same," she said, "but I felt completely different, like he had no power over me anymore." "Because he doesn't," Sophia said. "You found your own power." The professor took Eleanor's hand, something he had never done before. His touch was warm and gentle. "You are the most remarkable woman I have ever met, Lady Eleanor. To change so much in such a short time, to find such strength within yourself." Eleanor looked down at their joined hands, then up at his face. His eyes were full of something she had never seen in a man's eyes before. Not the cold approval the Duke had sometimes given her when she acted just right, but a warm light that seemed to see all the way into her heart. "I'm not remarkable," she said. "I just finally had the chance to be myself." "And that," said the professor, "is what makes you remarkable." Outside the window, snow began to fall again, soft and silent. But inside Eleanor something was growing, something warm and bright and stronger than she had ever thought she could be. Spring came to Wildwood Cottage like a painter with a magic brush. The snow melted, and green shoots poked through the dark dirt. The trees that had been bare all winter grew tiny light green leaves. Birds that had been gone came back, singing songs that woke Eleanor early each morning. In the garden, Eleanor and Margaret worked side by side, planting seeds and small plants. Eleanor's hands were not soft and white anymore, but strong and capable. She knew the names of all the plants now, and when to water them, and how to help them grow. Inside the cottage, things were changing too. The professor came almost every day now. Sometimes he and Eleanor walked on the beach, looking for fossils or just talking. Sometimes they sat in Sophia's library, reading books or looking at maps of faraway places. And sometimes they just sat in the garden, watching the plants grow and the bees buzz from flower to flower. "I got a letter today," the professor said one warm afternoon as they sat on a bench near the rose bushes, "from the university in Florence. They want me to come back and teach about the fossils I've found here." Eleanor felt her heart sink like a stone in water. "You're leaving?" The professor looked at her with those kind, dark eyes that seemed to see right into her heart. "That depends," he said. "On what?" "On you, Eleanor." He had never called her just Eleanor before. It had always been Lady Eleanor, proper and formal. The way he said her name now, soft and warm, made her cheeks feel hot. "I don't understand," she said, looking down at her hands. The professor took her hands in his. "I love you, Eleanor," he said simply. "Not the lady you were trained to be, but the real woman you are. The one who gets dirt under her nails in the garden and stays up late reading books about stars. The one who dances with village girls and stands up to dukes." Eleanor couldn't speak. Her heart was beating so fast she thought it might fly out of her chest like the birds from the trees. "I want you to come to Florence with me," the professor went on. "Not as a proper English wife who sits at home and pours tea, but as my partner. The university needs someone to translate English science books. You could do that work, and you could study whatever you want." "You want me to work?" Eleanor asked. "Ladies didn't work. It wasn't done." "I want you to be who you really are," the professor said, "not who society says you should be." Eleanor looked out at the garden, at the sea beyond, at the sky so big and blue above them. "Can I think about it?" she asked. The professor nodded. "Of course. It's a big decision. I'll wait for your answer." That night, Eleanor couldn't sleep. She got out of bed and went to the window seat, looking out at the moon making a silver path on the dark sea. Go to Italy? Leave everything she knew? Work at a university? A soft knock came at her door. It was Sophia, in her nightdress with a shawl around her shoulders, I saw your light, Sophia said, coming to sit beside Eleanor. Can't sleep. The professor asked me to go to Florence with him, Eleanor said. I know, Sophia nodded. He asked my permission first, the old-fashioned dear. What did you tell him? I told him it wasn't my permission he needed, but yours. Eleanor looked out at the sea again. I don't know what to do, Aunt Sophia. If I go with him, I'll be turning my back on everything I was raised to be. My parents would be so ashamed. Society would whisper about me even more than they already do. And if you don't go? Sophia asked. If you stay here, or go back to London and find a proper husband who won't ask you to work or think. Eleanor thought about that. Going back to being a proper lady, always saying the right things, never getting dirt under her nails or staying up late to watch the stars, never dancing with village girls or feeling the warm sun on her face as she worked in the garden. I'd be safe, she said, but I wouldn't be me. Sophia squeezed her hand. The choice is yours, my dear. Just remember, safety isn't always found where we think it is. The next morning a letter arrived from Lord Blackwood. It was an invitation to a big party at his house. The Duke of Westmoreland would be there, and many other important people from London. He says he's sorry for how the Duke spoke to me in the village, Eleanor told Sophia as they had breakfast. He wants to make it up to me by introducing me to his friends who might be able to help me get back into London society. Are you going to go? Sophia asked, buttering her toast. Eleanor thought for a moment. Yes, I think I will, but not for the reason Lord Blackwood thinks. Blackwood Manor was the biggest house in the area, with tall windows that glowed with light as Eleanor's carriage pulled up the long drive. Men in fancy coats helped ladies in silk dresses out of their carriages. Music spilled out the open doors, along with the buzz of many people talking. Eleanor wore her best dress, the blue one that matched her eyes. Her hair was up, but not in the fancy curls she used to wear. Instead, it was in a simple style that Margaret had helped her with. She wore no jewels except a small pin the professor had given her, a tiny fossil of a sea star set in silver. Inside, the big hall was full of people, most of them from London. Eleanor felt their eyes on her as she walked in, heard the whispers behind fans and gloved hands. There she is, the girl the Duke rejected. I heard she's been living like a hermit with her crazy aunt. They say she works in the garden like a servant. Eleanor kept her head high and her back straight. The whispers couldn't hurt her now. They were just noise like the wind in the trees or the waves on the shore. Lord Blackwood came to meet her, a tall man with friendly eyes. Lady Eleanor, I'm so glad you came. I wanted to apologise again for the Duke's rudeness in the village. Thank you, Lord Blackwood, but no apology is needed. The Duke was just being himself, Lord Blackwood laughed. You have changed, Lady Eleanor. There's a spark in you that wasn't there when I saw you at Montclair's. Is that a good thing? Eleanor asked. I think it is, Lord Blackwood said. Come, let me introduce you to some people who will find you as interesting as I do. For the next hour, Eleanor talked with Lord Blackwood's friends. They weren't like the people she had known in London. They asked about the books she was reading and listened to her talk about fossils. They didn't seem to care that she'd been rejected by the Duke or that she worked in a garden. Then a cold voice spoke behind her. Lady Eleanor, what a surprise to see you in proper society again. Eleanor turned to face the Duke of Westmoreland. He looked just the same, handsome in a cold way, with eyes that judged everything they saw. Your Grace, she said with a small bow, not as surprised as I am to see you here. I thought you avoided places where people might think for themselves. The Duke's eyes narrowed. You have become impertinent, Lady Eleanor. Country life has ruined your manners. No, Eleanor said, feeling strong and calm. It has just helped me find my true self, the self that was always there, hidden under all the rules and expectations. And what self is that? The Duke asked with a sneer. A girl who plays in the dirt and talks about rocks with a foreign professor? Yes, Eleanor said simply. That's exactly who I am, and I'm happy. The Duke looked surprised. He had expected her to be hurt by his words, to feel small and ashamed, but she didn't. You've made a mistake, you know, he said, his voice lower now. You could have been a duchess. You could have had fine clothes and jewels and a big house in London. And would I have had your respect? Eleanor asked. Would you have valued my mind, my heart, my true self? Or would you have wanted me to stay quiet and pretty, a perfect doll to sit on your shelf? The Duke didn't answer, which was answer enough. I'm glad you rejected me that night, Eleanor said, surprising herself with the words. It was the best thing that ever happened to me. It forced me to find out who I really am." The Duke's face hardened. "You're making a bigger mistake now, with that professor. He can't give you what I could have." "He's already given me more," Eleanor said. "He's given me the freedom to be myself." With that, she turned and walked away from the Duke, feeling lighter than she had in years, as if a heavy weight she had been carrying all her life had finally been lifted from her shoulders. Outside on the terrace, with the stars bright above her, Eleanor found the professor waiting. "How did it go?" he asked. "I saw you talking to the Duke." "It went well," Eleanor said. "I finally said what I've wanted to say for months." The professor took her hands. "And have you thought about my question? About Florence?" Eleanor looked up at the stars, then back at the man whose eyes were so kind and whose heart was so good. "Yes," she said. "I've made my choice." The wedding day dawned bright and clear, with a sky so blue it hurt the eyes to look at it. In the garden of Wildwood Cottage, Margaret had been up since sunrise, putting flowers everywhere. There were roses as big as teacups, daisies like tiny suns, and sweet peas that climbed the walls and filled the air with their smell. The garden looked nothing like the grand church in London, where Eleanor had once thought she would be married. There were no marble columns or stained glass windows, no rows of wooden pews where hundreds of guests would sit. Instead, there were simple wooden chairs set in a circle around a space under an apple tree. The tree was full of pale pink blooms that sometimes fell like snow when the wind blew. In her room, Eleanor stood in front of the mirror. She wore a dress of light blue silk, simple but pretty. There were no diamonds in her hair, no long veil, no train that needed 6 girls to carry it. Just a crown of small white flowers that Margaret had made for her. "You look beautiful," Sophia said, coming into the room. "Like yourself, but on the happiest day of your life." Eleanor smiled. "I never thought my happiest day would be here in this small place, marrying a man who wants me to work and think." "That's because you never knew what would truly make you happy," Sophia said. "You only knew what you were told should make you happy." Outside, Eleanor could hear people arriving. Not hundreds of London's finest in their fanciest clothes, but a small group of people who had become her friends. Dr. Harrison, who had first brought the professor to Wildwood, Lady Montclair and her husband, the old librarian from the village, Lord Blackwood, who had surprised everyone by standing up to the Duke when he tried to stop the wedding, and a few of the village people who had danced with Eleanor that winter night at the inn. There was also a letter on Eleanor's desk, from her parents. They would not come to the wedding. They could not understand why she would choose a foreign professor with no title over a duke. But the letter ended with a line that made Eleanor's heart lighter. "We hope one day to understand your choice, and perhaps to meet the man who has won your heart where a duke could not." "It's time," Sophia said, holding out her hand. Eleanor took a deep breath and went downstairs, through the house, and out into the garden she knew so well, where she had learned so much from Margaret's silent teaching. The professor stood under the apple tree, looking more handsome than any duke in his simple dark suit with a white rose in his lapel. His eyes lit up when he saw her, a look of such love and pride that Eleanor felt her heart might burst. As she walked toward him, with Sophia beside her instead of her father, Eleanor remembered the other wedding she had almost had. It would have been in London, in a church as big as a castle. Everyone who mattered in society would have been there, watching her walk down a red carpet on her father's arm, toward a man who thought she was empty inside. "I made the right choice," she whispered to herself as she reached the professor and took his hands. The wedding was simple and short. They made promises to love each other, to stand by each other, to be partners in all things. When the professor put the ring on Eleanor's finger, it wasn't a big diamond that would show how rich and important he was. It was a small gold band with tiny fossils set into it, sea stars and shells from the beach where they had walked together. "So you'll always have a piece of where we began," he said quietly. After they had food and drinks in the garden, everyone talked and laughed. Margaret moved among the guests, serving food and smiling her quiet smile. When she passed Eleanor, she made a quick sign with her hands that Eleanor understood now. Happiness, love, forever. "Thank you," Eleanor signed back, "for everything you taught me." That night, as the stars came out, Eleanor and her new husband walked on the beach below Wildwood Cottage. The waves whispered on the sand and the moon made a bright path across the water. "Are you ready for our journey?" the professor asked, holding her hand tight in his. Eleanor looked up at the stars, the same stars she had learned about from Sophia's books, the same stars that would shine over Florence, their new home. "Yes," she said. "I'm ready for everything." 6 months later, Eleanor stood on the small balcony of their apartment in Florence. The city spread out below her, a beautiful mix of old and new. Church towers and red-tiled roofs, green gardens and blue rivers, and always the perfect blue sky above. Inside, the professor, Alessandro as she called him now, was working at his desk. Their apartment wasn't big or grand like the Duke's house would have been, but it was full of books and fossils and things they loved. The walls were covered with maps and drawings. Every shelf held stones and shells they had found together on beaches from England to Italy. From her balcony, Eleanor could see into the university courtyard. Margaret was there, showing a group of students how to plant a new kind of flower. After the wedding, Margaret had surprised everyone by accepting Alessandro's offer to come to Florence too. The university needed a gardener, and Margaret knew plants better than anyone. Now she was teaching others, without saying a word. Eleanor went inside and sat at her own desk, which faced Alessandro's across their sunny room. On it lay the pages of her first book, a guide to fossils for young people, with pictures she had drawn herself. The university would publish it next month. "How is it coming?" Alessandro asked, looking up from his own work. "Well," Eleanor said, "I just finished the chapter on how to tell the age of a fossil by the kind of rock it's in." "My brilliant wife," Alessandro said with a proud smile. "The students already say you explain things better than their other teachers." Eleanor blushed. She still wasn't used to being praised for her mind instead of her pretty face or good manners, but she liked it much better. A knock came at the door. It was a letter from England, from Sophia. As Eleanor read it, she gasped. "What is it?" Alessandro asked. "The Duke is getting married," Eleanor said, "to a rich American girl whose father wants a title for his daughter." Alessandro came to read over her shoulder. "Does that make you sad?" Eleanor thought for a moment. "No," she said honestly. "It makes me feel sorry for the girl. I hope she knows what she's getting into." "Or maybe she'll surprise him," Alessandro said. "Maybe she'll be stronger than he thinks, like you were." Eleanor put the letter down and went to the window again. The sun was setting now, turning the red roofs of Florence to gold. On the street below, people were walking home from work. Students sat in the cafes talking about books and ideas. Church bells rang in the distance. All of it was so different from the life she had once thought she wanted. That life would have been safe but small. This life was bigger and sometimes harder, but so much more real. "Sophia says the Duke still talks about me at parties," Eleanor said. "He tells people I made a terrible mistake, that I gave up a great life for a small one." Alessandro came and put his arms around her from behind. "And what do you think?" Eleanor turned in his arms to face him. "I think he's wrong. I think my life now is much bigger than it would have been with him. I work, I learn, I see new places and meet new people. I'm not just someone's wife or someone's daughter. I'm myself." Alessandro kissed her forehead. "And that self is more wonderful than any duchess could ever be." That night, as they got ready for bed, Eleanor looked at herself in the mirror. She wasn't the perfect lady she had been trained to be. Her skin was brown from the Italian sun. Her hands were marked with ink stains from her writing and rough from working in their small garden on the roof. Her hair was simply braided, the way Margaret had taught her. But her eyes were bright and alive in a way they had never been before. They were the eyes of a woman who knew who she was and was happy with that person. She turned off the lamp and got into bed beside Alessandro, who was already half asleep. Outside, the moon shone on Florence, making the city look like something from a fairy tale. Eleanor closed her eyes, feeling more at home in this foreign place than she had ever felt in England. "The Duke was right about one thing," she whispered in the dark. "What's that?" Alessandro asked sleepily. "I was empty inside when he knew me," Eleanor said. "But that was because I hadn't had the chance to fill myself up yet. I needed to find my own way, not follow the path others set for me." Alessandro pulled her close. "And now?" Eleanor smiled in the darkness. "Now I'm full to the brim with all the things that matter. Work that means something. Places I never thought I'd see. People who love the real me. And most of all, the freedom to keep growing, keep learning, keep becoming more myself every day." She thought about the silent maid who had taught her so much without words, about Sophia who had shown her another way to live. about the Duke whose rejection had set her free, and about Alessandro who had seen the real Eleanor even when she was still finding her. What started as my greatest shame, she whispered, turned out to be my greatest gift.